The Galactic Trade Consortium headquarters floated in the void between three-star systems, a gleaming testament to bureaucratic access and architectural overcompensation. Its crystal spires twisted through space like the galaxy's most expensive DNA strand, each facet reflecting the light of distant suns while somehow managing to look pretentious about it. This was where civilizations came to genuflect before the altar of interstellar commerce, where trade routes were blessed and economic destinies decided by beings who had never met a regulation they couldn't multiply by 7. Inside the main assembly chamber, representatives from 43 species sat in carefully arranged hierarchies that would have made a medieval court jealous. The Valorians occupied the highest tier, their blue-scaled heads crowned with neural enhancement arrays that allegedly helped them process complex economic data, but mostly just made them look like they were wearing extremely expensive hats. Below them, the crystalline Nixari hummed in harmonious frequencies that translated roughly to, "We're better than you but not quite as good as the blue ones up there." The pecking order descended through various levels of pomposity until it reached the bottom tier, where newer member species sat with the desperate eagerness of middle managers hoping for a promotion. At the speaker's podium, Ambassador Helix of the Valorian Trade Ministry was delivering what could generously be called a speech, though it resembled more closely the sound a calculator might make if it had delusions of grandeur. The consortium has maintained galactic economic stability for 732 standard cycles, he intoned, his translator struggling with concepts that seemed designed to cure insomnia. Our selective membership policies ensure only the most sophisticated civilizations contribute to interstellar commerce. In the observation gallery, pressed against the reinforced viewing panels like kids at an aquarium, sat a delegation from Earth. They wore their best diplomatic uniforms, had practiced their most respectful bows, and carried briefcases full of economic projections that nobody was going to read. Their leader, Evelyn Cross, watched the proceedings with the expression of someone slowly realizing she had walked into the universe's most expensive practical joke. Next on the agenda, Ambassador Helix continued, consulting a holographic tablet that was approximately 3 times larger than necessary, application for consortium membership from the humans. He pronounced the word like it tasted of expired milk. A ripple of what might have been laughter, if laughter could sound condescending, passed through the assembly. Dr. Cross stood, smoothing her jacket with the reflexive gesture of someone about to deliver a presentation to a room full of people who had already decided she was wasting their time. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, learning protocol, studying trade regulations, and practicing the precise bow angles required for each species. None of it mattered. The decision had been made before she walked into the room. "Honored representatives," she began, and several aliens actually rolled their eyes. Or what passed for eyes in species that had evolved past such crude optical equipment. Earth formally requests consideration for membership in the Galactic Trade Consortium. Our species has demonstrated rapid technological advancement, resource management capabilities, and cultural adaptability that we believe would contribute significantly to interstellar commerce. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as concentrated awkwardness. Finally, Counselor Vex of the Zephyrian Commerce Guild spoke up, his tentacles undulating in what his species considered a gesture of polite dismissal. "The human application has been reviewed by our technical committee," he announced, consulting notes that appeared to have been written in crayon. "While your species shows enthusiasm, the consortium requires members with established interstellar trade networks, stable political systems, and proven economic models. We have established trade agreements with 16 systems," Cross replied, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Our economic growth over the past century has exceeded projections by 16 systems." Ambassador Helix interrupted, and his translator somehow managed to convey amusement. "The Valorian Empire maintains trade relationships with over 3,000 star systems. The humans have been in space for what? 200 cycles. We were calculating compound interest before your species discovered." More laughter rippled through the assembly, though it came out as a variety of clicks, hums and sounds that suggested someone was slowly deflating several balloons. Dr. Cross felt her jaw tighten, but maintained her diplomatic composure. She had expected resistance, not ridicule. "Perhaps," suggested Counselor Thane of the Hegemony Banking Collective, his metallic voice carrying the warmth of a tax audit, "the humans might consider applying for associate observer status. It requires no voting rights, no profit sharing, and only a modest annual fee, shall we say 10% of your planetary gross product. The offer hung in the air like a particularly insulting piñata. Dr. Cross looked around the chamber at faces that ranged from bored to barely contained mirth. These beings, who claimed to represent the pinnacle of galactic civilization, were essentially offering to let humanity pay for the privilege of watching them get rich. "We appreciate the consortium's generous offer," Cross said finally, her diplomatic training warring with an increasingly strong urge to tell the entire assembly exactly where they could file their associate observer status. However, Earth will need time to consider this opportunity. As the delegation gathered their ignored briefcases and wounded dignity, Dr. Cross couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something more significant than a simple rejection. In the back of her mind, a small voice was already asking a dangerous question. If they didn't want humanity at their table, what was stopping humans from building their own? Behind her, the consortium continued its session, blissfully unaware that they had just made what historians would later call a rather expensive mistake. But that realization lay in a future none of them could imagine, in a galaxy where being invited to the right table mattered far less than knowing how to build a better one. 6 months after the consortium's diplomatic equivalent of a wedgie, Cross found herself in considerably less prestigious surroundings. The frontier station orbiting Epsilon Eridani Bi was the kind of place where legitimate business people went to become significantly less legitimate, and where the coffee could dissolve hull plating if you weren't careful. It was also, as it turned out, exactly where one went to find civilizations that had been deemed unworthy of the consortium's golden embrace. The station's cantina operated under the generous assumption that health codes were more of a suggestion than a requirement. Alien species that couldn't agree on basic atmospheric preferences somehow managed to coexist in a haze of universal solvent and questionable life choices. Cross sat at a corner table, nursing something that claimed to be tea but tasted like liquid regret, while waiting for her first potential business partner. Enter the Drex. If natural selection had a sense of humor, the Drex were the punchline. They resembled what might happen if someone described an octopus to an artist who had never seen water, then asked that artist to design something that could survive in a methane atmosphere. Ambassador Flux, yes, that was actually his name, approached her table with the fluid grace of spilled pudding. "You are the human who wishes to circumvent the consortium," Flux stated, his translator rendering his chemical speech patterns into words that sounded like they were being filtered through a garbage disposal. "This pleases us. The Valorians once called our trade proposals biochemically offensive." Dr. Cross extended her hand, then quickly retracted it when she realized Flux didn't have anything that remotely resembled hands. "They seem to have strong opinions about a lot of things," she said diplomatically. "What did you want to trade?" "Exotic matter stabilizers," Flux replied, producing a small cube that seemed to bend space around itself. "Your species requires them for faster-than-light navigation. The consortium charges 16,000 credits per unit. We can provide them for 4,000. And the catch?" Flux's approximation of a smile would have given nightmares to anyone with a functional survival instinct. "They smell like rotting fish. For approximately 3 standard months, the Valorians consider this aesthetically unacceptable for civilized commerce." Dr. Cross leaned back in her chair, processing this information. The consortium's monopoly on exotic matter had kept humanity's expansion to a crawl. If the Drex could provide the same technology at a quarter of the price, who cared if it came with a free aromatherapy experience? "I think we can work with that," she said. "Humans are remarkably adaptable to unpleasant smells." Word of the human-Drex partnership spread through the station's gossip network faster than a computer virus, in a Windows 95 convention. Within a week, Dr. Cross found herself holding court in the cantina's back room, which had been hastily converted into what could generously be called a conference facility. The Gorlon Collective sent a representative, a species that looked like someone had crossed a porcupine with a filing cap. The Yith delegation arrived in environmental suits that suggested they considered the station's atmosphere roughly as hospitable as liquid fire. Even the enigmatic whisper beings showed up, though their method of communication required a translator that mostly produced ominous humming sound. Each species had the same story: brilliant innovations, valuable resources, or essential services that the consortium had rejected for reasons that ranged from arbitrary to actively insulting. The Gorlon manufactured quantum processors that were twice as fast as consortium standard, but had been rejected because they were shaped like tiny pyramids instead of the regulation sphere. The Yith had developed a revolutionary agricultural technique that could turn barren worlds into garden paradises, but the consortium had deemed their methods insufficiently traditional. Dr. Cross listened to each tale of bureaucratic blindness with growing fascination. These weren't failed civilizations or inferior species. They were innovators who had been excluded from the galaxy's primary market because they didn't fit the consortium's narrow definition of acceptable. It was like discovering that half the galaxy's best restaurants had been banned from the Food Critic's Guide because they served meals on the wrong-shaped plates. The Whisper beings, after much ominous humming, revealed they possessed navigation charts for previously unmapped star systems, rich in rare minerals. The Gorlon offered manufacturing capabilities that could outproduce most consortium worlds. The Yith proposed agricultural contracts that would solve food scarcity across dozens of systems. Individually, each species offered something valuable. Together they represented an economic force that could challenge the consortium's stranglehold on galactic trade. What you're describing, Doc Cross said, looking around the room at the collection of galactic rejects and outcasts, isn't just trade agreements. It's an entire alternative economy. The reactions varied by species. Tentacles waved, crystals chimed, and something that might have been applause echoed from the Whisper being's environmental suits. Ambassador Flux's chemical emissions took on what his translator optimistically called enthusiastic overtone. Of course, the consortium noticed. They would have been astronomically incompetent not to, and whatever their other flaws, the Valorians hadn't maintained galactic dominance by ignoring potential threats. The first sign of their displeasure arrived in the form of an official trade embargo. Suddenly, any ship carrying human cargo found itself subject to random inspections that lasted approximately forever. Docking fees at consortium-controlled ports mysteriously tripled. Permits that had taken days to process now required months of bureaucratic navigation through forms that seemed designed by someone who considered paperwork a form of performance art. The message was clear: play by their rules or don't play at all. Cross received the notification while reviewing production schedules with her new Drex partners. She read the embargo declaration twice, then set it aside with the expression of someone who had just been challenged to a game she was surprisingly eager to play. "They want to make this difficult," she said to Flux, who was currently resembling a pile of irritated spaghetti. "Fine, we'll build our own ports, establish our own trade routes, and create our own standards. Let's see how their monopoly holds up when half the galaxy has better options." The underground network was about to become significantly less underground, and somewhere in the crystal spires of the consortium headquarters, bureaucrats were about to learn that excluding humanity from their club hadn't eliminated the competition, it had just motivated them to build a better one. The consortium's response to Dr. Cross's growing network could best be described as the diplomatic equivalent of a toddler realizing someone else was playing with toys they had previously ignored. What had started as condescending dismissal quickly escalated into the kind of bureaucratic warfare that would have impressed Machiavelli, assuming Machiavelli had access to interstellar law firms and a pathological need to regulate everything that moved. The first salvo arrived in the form of the Galactic Commerce Regulation Enforcement Division, an organization whose acronym unfortunately spelled G-Cred, and whose agents possessed all the charm and flexibility of a tax audit conducted by robots with anger management issues. They descended upon the alternative network's operations like a plague of clipboards, armed with regulations that seemed to have been written by someone who considered breathing a privilege requiring proper documentation. "Attention unauthorized trade entities," announced Agent Vortex of the G-Cred Enforcement Squadron. His Valorian features twisted into an expression that suggested he had been personally offended by the existence of free enterprise. "You are in violation of Galactic Trade Code Section 47.3, conducting interspecies commerce without proper consortium oversight." He paused to consult a tablet that was apparently powered by concentrated bureaucracy. "The penalty is immediate cessation of all trade activities and fines equivalent to your gross planetary product for the next 17 cycles." Cross, who was currently overseeing the construction of humanity's third independent trading post, looked up from her holographic displays with the expression of someone who had just been told that breathing required a permit. And which specific law grants the consortium authority over trade between non-member species in neutral space? The question hung in the void like an unwelcome party guest. Agent Vortex's translator made several concerning noises before producing what might charitably be called an answer. The consortium's authority derives from established precedent and mutual agreement among civilized species. Ah, Dr. Cross replied, her smile containing enough contained frustration to power a small star. The "because we said so" clause of intergalactic law. How very civilized. The legal challenges multiplied like bureaucratic bacteria. Suddenly every shipment faced safety inspections that seemed designed by people who considered efficiency a form of moral failure. Trade routes were declared hazardous to navigation, based on criteria that appeared to have been generated by a random number generator with trust issues. The Drex found their exotic matter stabilizers, classified as potentially dangerous aromatics, while the Gorlan's pyramid-shaped processors were deemed geometrically non-compliant with standard interface protocol. But the consortium's masterpiece of petty tyranny was the introduction of the Universal Trade Compatibility Standards, a document that ran to approximately 4,000 pages, and seemed to have been written by someone who believed that trade should be as complicated as possible. According to the new regulations, all interspecies commerce required equipment manufactured to exact specifications, using materials that coincidentally could only be obtained from consortium-approved suppliers, at prices that suggested the suppliers had developed an unhealthy relationship with precious metals. The network's response came from an unexpected source, the Phantom Syndicate, a collection of species so far removed from consortium space that most galactic databases listed them as probably mythical. They materialized quite literally in some cases at one of humanity's trading posts, with technology that made the consortium's best efforts look like children playing with building blocks. Their representative, who went by the title of Echo and appeared to exist in several dimensions simultaneously, delivered what might have been the most diplomatically devastating statement in galactic history. We have observed the consortium's activities with interest. Their trade practices violate approximately 67% of the ethical standards maintained by civilized species in the outer spiral. We would be pleased to offer technological assistance to any network committed to equitable commerce. The gifts that followed redefined the concept of technological advancement. Quantum manufacturing systems that could produce anything with atomic precision. Communication networks that operated faster than light without requiring exotic matter. Defensive systems that made consortium military hardware look like decorative paperweights. Most importantly, economic analysis software that could predict market trends with the kind of accuracy that turned trade from gambling into a precision science. Armed with Phantom Syndicate technology, the alternative network transformed from a scrappy collection of outcasts into something that kept consortium economists awake at night in cold sweats. Trade routes that had taken weeks to navigate could now be completed in days. Manufacturing costs dropped so dramatically that the network could undercut consortium prices, while maintaining profit margins that would have made ancient robber barons weep with envy. The final blow came when the network announced the grand opening of the Free Trade Galactic Exchange, a massive station positioned at the intersection of 12 major trade routes that had somehow been overlooked by consortium cartographers. The station offered services that the consortium charged premium rates for, completely free, docking fees, eliminated, processing permits, instant approval, bureaucratic delays, apparently illegal under free trade exchange regulation. Within months, merchant vessels that had faithfully patronized consortium facilities for centuries began making mysterious detours to the free trade exchange. The Phantom Syndicate's technology allowed the station to handle traffic loads that would have overwhelmed traditional facilities, while their economic analysis systems optimized trade routes in real time, creating efficiency gains that bordered on the miraculous. The consortium's response was swift, predictable, and catastrophically stupid. They attempted to blockade the free trade exchange using their enforcement fleet, apparently unaware that the Phantom Syndicate's defensive gifts included weaponry that could disable ships without harming their crews, a technology that made consortium military doctrine obsolete overnight. The sight of the mighty Valorian enforcement fleet being gently but firmly escorted away from the free trade exchange by ships that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight was broadcast across the galaxy's communication network. The message was clear: The alternative network wasn't just competing with the consortium anymore. They were winning. Dr. Cross watched the broadcast from her office aboard the exchange. Surrounded by holographic displays showing trade volumes that would have been impossible under the old system, the network that had started as a collection of rejected species had become something unprecedented, an economic democracy where innovation mattered more than tradition, and where success was measured by mutual benefit rather than domination. The consortium, meanwhile, was about to discover that monopolies were significantly less monopolistic when someone built a better mousetrap and gave it away for free. 2 years after the Free Trade Exchange's grand opening, the Galactic Trade Consortium headquarters looked less like a monument to bureaucratic supremacy and more like an expensive museum piece that nobody particularly wanted to visit. Ships still docked at its crystal spires, but with the enthusiasm of tourists visiting a historical site rather than pilgrims seeking economic salvation. The waiting areas, once packed with supplicants bearing tribute and trade proposals, now echoed with the kind of emptiness usually reserved for philosophy lectures and tax preparation seminars. In the main assembly chamber, Ambassador Helix stood before a significantly reduced audience, delivering what amounted to a very expensive obituary for galactic commerce as they had known it. Trade volumes have decreased by 73%, he announced, his voice carrying all the joy of someone reading their own death certificate. Member species are experiencing difficulties maintaining previous profit margins. The truth, which hung in the air like an unwelcome dinner guest, was that the consortium had discovered what happens when a monopoly meets actual competition. The Free Trade Exchange hadn't just stolen their customers, it had made their entire business model look like a relic from the galaxy's less enlightened past. Why pay consortium rates when the exchange offered better services for free? Why navigate bureaucratic mazes when permits could be obtained instantly? Why submit to condescending lectures about civilized commerce when the alternative treated everyone like equal? Councillor Vex of the Zephyrian Commerce Guild, his tentacles drooping with what could charitably be called existential despair, raised the question that everyone had been avoiding. Perhaps, he suggested with all the enthusiasm of someone volunteering for root canal surgery, we should consialogue with the human-led network. The silence that followed could have been marketed as a luxury product for people who collected awkward pauses. Ambassador Helix's facial expression suggested he was processing a concept so foreign it required translation from theoretical physics into basic emotional responses. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that we negotiate with species we previously deemed unsuitable for membership. I am suggesting, Vex replied, his translator somehow managing to convey resignation, that our current approach has resulted in what economists call catastrophic market failure, and what everyone else calls going out of business. The consortium's first official communication with Dr. Cross arrived with all the diplomatic subtlety of a formal surrender disguised as a business proposal. Ambassador Helix, flanked by a delegation that looked like they were attending their own funeral, presented themselves at the Free Trade Exchange, with the kind of forced humility usually reserved for tax evaders meeting with auditors. The consortium wishes to explore collaborative opportunities with your organization, Helix announced, consulting notes that appeared to have been written by someone experiencing physical pain. We believe that our combined resources could benefit all parties involved. Cross, who was currently reviewing expansion plans that would add 17 new trading posts across 3 spiral arms, looked up from her work with the expression of someone who had just been offered a very expensive, but completely unnecessary product. I see, she said, her tone carrying exactly the right amount of polite interest to be diplomatically devastating. And what specific benefits would the consortium bring to this collaboration? The question hung in the air like a mathematical proof that nobody wanted to solve. The uncomfortable truth was that the consortium's primary assets, regulatory authority, exclusive trade agreements, and monopolistic control, had become liabilities in a galaxy where better alternatives existed. They were essentially offering to help build a house that had already been completed, painted, and furnished. We bring centuries of experience in galactic commerce, Helix said finally, the words emerging with the confidence of someone trying to sell ice to penguins. Our expertise in regulatory frameworks and in established protocols could be very helpful, Dr. Cross agreed, in understanding exactly what practices our network should avoid. Thank you for the educational opportunity. The negotiations that followed resembled less a business discussion and more a masterclass in diplomatic role reversal. The species that had once dismissed humanity as too primitive for their exclusive club now found themselves explaining why they deserved a place in the very network they had rejected. The Valorians, who had lectured about economic sophistication, presented trade proposals with the desperate creativity of students who had forgotten about a term paper until the night before it was due. The Hegemony Banking Collective offered to process transactions for the exchange, apparently unaware that Phantom Syndicate technology had made traditional banking about as relevant as stone tablets in a digital library. The Nixari attempted to provide their harmonic frequency analysis services, not realizing that the exchange's quantum computation systems could perform the same calculations in microseconds, rather than the standard 6-hour crystalline resonance cycle. Each offer was politely declined, not out of spite, but because the alternative network had simply evolved beyond the need for what the consortium considered valuable. It was like watching horse and buggy manufacturers trying to sell transportation services to a civilization that had invented teleportation. Cross gathered her core advisory council, representatives from dozens of species that had built something unprecedented together to discuss the consortium's requests for inclusion. The meeting took place in the exchange's central chamber, a space designed by Phantom Syndicate architects, who apparently believed that conference rooms should inspire both comfort and awe. Through the transparent walls, the lights of hundreds of ships twinkled like stars, representing a galaxy where trade flowed freely and fairly. "They want in," she said simply, looking around at faces, tentacles, crystalline formations, and energy patterns that represented the most successful economic alliance in galactic history. The question is, what do we want to do about it? The discussion that followed revealed something remarkable about the network they had built. Unlike the consortium's hierarchical structure, decisions were made through consensus among equal. Every species had a voice, every proposal was considered, and success was measured not by dominance, but by mutual prosperity. In the end, the decision was unanimous and elegantly simple. The free trade exchange would welcome any species or organization that committed to the principles of equitable commerce, transparent dealings, and mutual respect. This included former consortium members, but only as equal partners, rather than dominant authority. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The network that had been built by species, deemed unworthy of the consortium's attention, had become so successful that the consortium now sought membership in it. The table that humanity hadn't been invited to join had been replaced by a better table that welcomed everyone. Ambassador Helix, upon receiving the exchange's terms of membership, discovered what it felt like to be offered associate observer status with no voting rights, no profit sharing, and only a modest annual fee. The expression on his blue-scaled features suggested he was experiencing what humans call a learning moment. Cross watched from her office as the first former consortium vessels approached the exchange under the new partnership agreements, their running lights joining the constellation of free trade that stretched across the galaxy. She had set out to prove that humanity deserved a seat at the galactic table. Instead, she had discovered something far more valuable. Sometimes the best response to exclusion isn't fighting for acceptance, but building something so much better that everyone else wants to join you. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between being invited to someone else's table and knowing how to set your own. And humanity, it turned out, made excellent hosts.